Hi, I'm Allie Hamilton, and I'm so happy to welcome you to the Come As You Are podcast. Every week, we'll be talking about some aspect of healing, usually around childhood wounds and complicated familial relationships. The topics will always coincide with my personal essay of the week, and this will be a place where we can take a deep dive together. I'm so thrilled you've joined me and delighted for you to always come as you are. Hi there. Hi there. Welcome to our talk today. The topic is forsaken when you don't get the mother load. And the topic this week, the essay that I wrote this week, was inspired by an essay that Andrea Skinner wrote about her mother, Alice Munro, beloved short story writer, Canadian writer, lauded for writing about, in particular, the inner lives of women and girls. I'm not going to name the things that were said because I know that it can be really triggering for people, but you can certainly read my essay and read Andrea Skinner's essay, which I feel, everyone ought to read. I think her story deserves to be told after all these years. But I am going to talk about what it is like when you grow up with a mother who, either struggles to mother you or neglects to mother you or betrays you in some of the worst possible ways, which certainly happened to Andrea Skinner. Also just people who are dealing with mothers who are stunted emotionally in some way or another and not able to show up. And all the things that our culture tells us and society tells us about, like what a mother should be, which is also part of, what is wrapped up in this whole thing. I'm also not going to get into too much detail about my own. There were two instances in my life when I really, really needed my mom to show up for me and comfort me and, back me up, fight for me, choose me. And she was unable to do that, or unwilling, but I think it was more unable for her own reasons. And I'm going to talk about my mom a little bit because, I think that there are similar reasons that sometimes people struggle in this role. And for my mom, I can tell you that she had her own trauma. And this is not an excuse. I'm not excusing. Things happen, and some of them are, no matter how far you try to twist yourself and extend compassion and understand, some things really boggle the mind. And I felt that way reading Andrea Skinner's essay, and I felt that way at a few times in my life. It was really, really just hard to fathom, and there is no need to excuse behavior that is just hurtful and inexplicable, right? You don't have to make things make sense. Some things will never make sense, but I think it's good to talk about this because it is really painful when you are growing up and you feel like your parent, your mom, doesn't love you, isn't showing up for you the way other people's mothers seem to be showing up for them. And it might be both parents, like my dad was also woefully ill-equipped to be a good parent and to put me first. And I do think that that is part of parenting. I know for myself, I had my son when I was 36 and my daughter when I was 39, and I'm incredibly grateful that I was the age that I was when I had my children because I had been through enough in my life to, I'd really done some work on like what my stuff is, what my issues are. We all have our things, we all have our blind spots, we all have our tendencies that maybe aren't serving us, or old stories that we're telling ourselves that are like disempowering us, or just like storylines that we're feeding that are keeping us stuck. So I had done a lot of that work before I had my children. I wanted them. I wanted them more than anything. So I was really ready to receive them as the gifts that they are, that they are. And everyone deserves to be received that way. That is my absolute belief. We all deserve to, we don't ask, right? We just show up here earthside. So it's like, and you can't survive on the outside. There's that sort of fourth trimester conversation. You can't survive without love, without somebody there to nurture you, hold you, feed you, comfort you when you're crying, change you. Make sure that you're safe. If you were left out in the wild, you wouldn't make it. And so it's a very real thing that the way that the people that were there, your primary caregivers, when you showed up, however equipped or not equipped they were, like, it's not a reflection on you, but it's going to have a serious impact on you and the way that you feel about yourself. And sometimes that's like that sort of, second act work is figuring out, okay, a whole bunch of things happened and I gleaned information from the way that I was received, treated, nurtured or not nurtured, about who I am and what my place is in the world and whether I matter or I don't matter. And like, maybe I need to unravel some of that because, maybe it had more to do with the lack of preparedness on the part of my primary caregivers than it did anything to do intrinsically with me, inherently with me. It took me a long time to figure that out. Nothing feels more personal, I don't think, than like how your mom is behaving towards you, right? And I don't mean to devalue fathers in this situation. And some people are not, their primary caregivers were not their biological parents. So there's just like a whole spectrum of, people that we're talking about as primary caregivers here. But I do think there is something, you grow inside your mom, you can hear her voice before you even like come out into the world. There's just a real bond there, whether it is sustained or not once you arrive. But I think in my case, my mother's trauma, I think, really made it difficult for her to show up fully and really love me and be there for me. Her dad died when she was 13. And at a certain point in my life, I started to recognize that some of my mom's growth kind of like stopped at 13. And that's the thing that can happen with trauma, just you're stunted. And when I could react or recognize that her 13-year-old self was often running the show, it made things make sense in a way that they didn't otherwise. When I started to understand because for the first like 10, 12 years of my life, I would say, I, like all of us, right, you sort of look at your primary caregivers as these godlike creatures. They're bigger, they seem to understand what's going on, they're, some way or another, like keeping a roof over your head, or they're the person that you're depending on to like eat and survive, whether they're able to keep a roof over your head or not. So there's just a natural inclination to think of these people as the people with the answers and the people who are certainly, sustaining life for those however many number of years. I would say a good 10 to 12 years. So I had that feeling for a while. but things were going wrong. There were things that were happening that just didn't seem okay to me. And some of those things were happening at my mom's house for sure. She started really drinking heavily when I was 8, and that continued for the rest of her life, right up until the end when she couldn't drink anymore. She had a feeding tube at the very end of her life, so she wasn't drinking those last few months. And that was really the first time in her life since I had been 8 that she wasn't, she wasn't drinking. And it did make a huge difference. But so that was part of the story with my mother, was alcoholism. And I think that she was somewhere on the narcissism scale somewhere. And I don't mean NPD. I'm not talking about clinical narcissistic personality disorder. I think narcissism gets thrown around a lot. I don't think that's where she was, because she could feel empathy for people, certainly her friends. Any of her friends who were ever like down on their luck, they always had a place to stay. She'd always open her house. She was a good friend. I think she was a good, somebody who would be good to have as your aunt, or but she was very difficult. It was difficult to be her daughter. And I would not speak for my brother. Like, he could talk about whether it was difficult to be her son, but for me it was definitely difficult to be her daughter. And by the time she had my brother, she was 11 years older. She was in a different marriage, it was a different situation, and she was more able to show up in that capacity. And that was really confusing for me too, because it did feel even more personal then. I thought, well, she's able to be affectionate with my brother. She's on the PTA. She's showing up for these like school fundraisers, and that never happened in my childhood. So it was definitely like one of those things that I was really grappling with for most of my childhood. Like, why doesn't my mother love me? When she drank, she would unleash her rage on me. And it was a regular thing, and it was scary and confusing and heartbreaking because I loved her. So that was my situation there. And I'm going to focus on that. Yes, my dad also completely, he was wrapped up in his own stuff and was not able to be a good dad, but he also had his good qualities. And I think he was a good uncle and a good friend. Well, he didn't have a lot of friends, but he did later in life. He had a lot of female friends who, really seemed to adore him. He always had lady friends, but I'm talking about something different. So, neither one of my parents was really well equipped to parent in the way that I feel, by the time I had my children, I had really worked through a lot of my stuff. Doesn't mean I'd worked through all of it. Doesn't mean I've gotten everything right along the way. I certainly have not. But I was ready. I was emotionally ready to be there and to show up for them and to put them first. And not all of us had that. In fact, many of us didn't. As I got older, a couple of things happened that I wrote about at length in the essay, and some of them are triggering. So again, I'm not going to get into it too much, but I had a couple of things, more than a couple, but 2 in particular that were really, really painful and extreme with men. And when I needed my mom to be there, she was not able to do that. And that was a huge betrayal, particularly the second time. I really, really needed her. And I think that it was too painful for her to believe me. And so she chose to believe the stranger in the situation, essentially, someone, we barely knew. And it was a real turning point in my relationship with her, because I felt so just horribly betrayed and let down, but also so much rage. I remember just feeling so much rage and not knowing what to do with it. not knowing where to put it, because in my upbringing, like, you were not allowed to be angry. Like, rage, you're not going to express that. You get in trouble if you if you express that you're angry about anything. So it was rough. And what ended up happening for me is just debilitating migraines that started when I was around this age that this second event happened. Eat like disordered eating, and just all of my prior years I had spent trying to earn her love, her attention, her approval, her affection. And she wasn't affectionate with me, and she wasn't one to sort of like heap on the verbal praise. And so it was rough. And I had definitely developed that, like, how do I, you know, how can I, like, what do I need to do, to get her to love me? And then there were questions kind of swimming underneath the surface of my whole childhood, which were, why doesn't she love me? And, like, why am I not lovable? Eventually, if your own mom can't love you, it's kind of like, what happens? You start to wonder, like, well, am I just not lovable? Am I broken? Like, what is happening? Because it feels like that's the primary place where you go for love, right? Your mom. um, and so I'm going to hit pause there on that topic and talk about society and the pressure that is put. Not everyone is cut out for motherhood or for parenthood, period. There are people who are, because of their own trauma or their own limitations, their own whatever it is, right? The way that their trauma has kind of like caused them to grow in whatever coping mechanisms they've had, or however, maybe their inability to attach in a consistent, loving way with their primary caregivers. And we can go back to narcissism there for a minute. And that's really what, if you're talking about narcissistic personality disorder, it's usually coming from. And again, this is a study. This is not like, these are not facts, but this is like the best information that we have. It is an inability to attach to the primary caregivers in a consistent, loving way. It can be the result of neglect or abuse, place where a person, child is going through so much pain, they sort of dissociate and just, they're not, they split off and kind of take their heart, somewhere else. Certainly, like any different form of trauma, like being in an alcoholic household, like there are a lot of reasons that people can struggle to attach in a loving, consistent way with their primary caregivers. And that is generally what you're looking at when you are looking at someone who has narcissistic personality disorder. There are people who don't have any of that and are just, because of life and because of the way they were taught and because of a whole bunch of other, they tend to be self-absorbed. That's a different thing. That's a different thing than what I'm talking about. I'm talking about an inability to feel empathy for other people. And you might have met people like that. They're usually very charismatic. They might be fascinating in the beginning. But when push comes to shove and there's conflict or something goes wrong or you suddenly are like feeling hurt, good luck getting an apology. Good luck getting any kind of accountability. And that is what I experienced. So I do think for my mom, she could never be wrong. And I mean, I can count on like one finger the number of I'm sorry's I got in my life. And so that's rough. Like when you are so afraid to get something wrong, you just won't admit. You will not give the person the respect and understanding to say, I'm sorry, I let you down, I'm sorry. It's really difficult to be on the other end of that and to have to sort of like do the math in your head where you're doing both sides of the equation to forgive someone, to accept an apology you were never given. And I did a lot of that with my mom for my whole life, where I just would at a certain point in time, I stopped trying to say to her, hey, this really hurt my feelings, or this thing that you said was like awful, because she wouldn't own it ever. And what I learned instead, she would also, and I did write about this in the essay, she would go for my jugular as I got older. So she was not, if she was angry, there was no filter. There was no sort of like, I'm not going to say that, I'm not going to say the worst possible thing because this is my child. I don't want to hurt her. She didn't have that if she was enraged. So she would use anything in her arsenal to attack. And so I learned not to confide in her. And it became a real practice for me because I'm not talking about painting such a painful picture here that you might be thinking, what was in it for you? Like what caused you to have this person in your life? There were a lot of good qualities there too. She was a force. She would walk into a room, you could not miss it. She was very smart. She could be really kind. She was just a very dynamic, wonderful person in many ways. Like her friends, we had a Zoom memorial for her because this happened. She passed away during COVID, which was, not a lot of us went through that. I think we lost people at that time. It was very painful to not be able to congregate, to be in person with people who could hug you or, talk to you face to face. But we had a Zoom memorial for her, and so many of her friends were there to talk about all the different ways she showed up for them. So I think, and that can be such a disconnect sometimes where you are the child of someone who is, all these people are saying all these amazing things and you're like, wow, it's not easy being this person's child, but like, okay, and I think that Alice Munro fits into that category as well, where her child must have just been watching this, her grown child, and thinking like, wow, my mom is being so celebrated. And yet I have this whole other bird's eye view on her incredibly profound flaws as a human being. And both things can be true. Both things can be true at once. And I was writing about this too, because there is a tendency, I think, when we love someone's work, whatever their work might be, to put them on a pedestal, or to idolize them, or to think of them as like a hero, or an icon or a treasure. And I certainly felt that way about Alice Munro until I read this essay. And it has very much changed my perception. It doesn't mean that she wasn't a beautiful writer, but she was a very, very flawed and disappointing human being and mother, certainly. Like, she really let her child down, and she created a situation in her family that was just, so painful for everyone, I think, for all the siblings, but particularly her youngest daughter, who she just betrayed in the worst possible way. When you choose a partner over your child, for me, like, you failed. If we're talking about something like this, like you've failed as a parent. And some people they're going to fail as parents. It doesn't mean that they don't know how to write. It just means they really did not rise to the occasion as in all their different roles. And it's hard to like grapple with that and reconcile. But I can tell you, not just with writers, because this is not, the first time I've learned something about a writer I loved for years where I'm like, oh, really? It's not. And we've all been through this. There are filmmakers, there are musicians, there are pieces of art sometimes that are so meaningful to you and so comforting and so like you just feel seen and understood, and then you learn something about the artist that is just deeply, deeply horrifying or disappointing, and it, and there are books written about whether you can still appreciate someone's art when you find out they're a monstrous person. I'm not going to you know, get into that. I linked to a book in the essay if you're interested in that. But I think it is the same thing. It's like we all have to grapple with this stuff on our own, Like, can you still listen to someone's music if you found out they were just an absolutely, devastating person who hurt people? Like, can you still? And this happens like also in the yoga community. I mean, I can't tell you how many, times I've either studied with someone, or this is back in my 20s before I understood, oh, everyone's human. Everyone's human. Nobody's going on a pedestal. Like, I got that lesson pretty quickly, but it took a few experiences for me to understand everyone is human. If you are talking about any person who's walking on the face of the earth, don't get confused. Don't be putting people on pedestals. You can admire people. You can think, wow, this person really has interesting, great things to say that are really helpful, or making me think about things in a different way, or making me question things. That's great. But the minute you start making someone sort of like a godlike creature, there's only one way for them to go. And we all know which way that is. So, that happens in the yoga community left and right. I mean, and so, yeah, you learn not to be doing that and not to get confused, because you're going to be let down. But I think the part of this whole story that really just, it got me down. I mean, really, my heart went out to her daughter, because it is such a mind, to be in that situation, to be in so much pain because of the action or inaction of your mother, and then to see all these people say, oh, she's so amazing, and you're sitting there okay. It makes you question your own perception and you feel very alone. You feel very alone in the situation, and that's painful. And so I wrote the essay, and there are some really interesting comments and, people who certainly relate. And I was talking about Danny Shapiro, I'm so lucky, she's a very close friend, has a beautiful podcast called Family Secrets. And that's all about what I'm talking about. Sometimes there are secrets swimming underneath the surface of a family, and they wreak havoc. And in my life, the secret in my household was my mother's alcoholism. It wasn't a secret to anybody in the house, but it was something that nobody would name except me. I kept trying to say, this doesn't feel right. I think she needs help. I don't think she's okay. And I was shut down and told that it was my perception, and there was nothing wrong with my mom. She was a social drinker. It was not the case. But it was, not only not to be named inside the house, certainly not to be discussed outside the house. And it was brutal, and those places where she was unable, I think for my mother, somebody in the comments said, some people just shouldn't have children, and some people actually don't know how to love. And you can twist yourself in knots trying to convince yourself that they did really love you, but the truth is they didn't. That may very well be the case for some people. That was not the case in my situation. I think in most situations, what you're dealing with is someone who is there's a real problem inside for someone who has a child and can't, respond in the way that I think most of us would respond if anyone we loved were in trouble, not just our child, anyone that we loved were not okay. Most of us would go running, try to help, get in the line of fire. If you're talking about people that you genuinely are your close people, show up, bring back up, whatever. You can run in and try to do whatever you can to help. And I think when you're missing that chip, like something has gone really wrong. So in my mother's case, there were times, there were things that she could do and would do. She wouldn't let anybody else, treat me badly, except for like these giant things that happened, where she just refused to. I think she really struggled to deal with the painful things in life and the things that made her feel powerless. She just wanted to edit out like they didn't happen. And I have talked about this before and I've written about it, but really the worst day of my life was my cousin, who I grew up with, who was really more like a brother. His 6-year-old son passed away because of brain tumors. And it was I just, I, my mom didn't go to the funeral. And this was like my mother's brother's son who had lost his son. And she had a trip planned. And she just said, like, I can't change the trip. They were going to Europe. But there was only one right place to be that day, and she couldn't do it. And it wasn't the trip. It was an inability to face the worst things in life. She just needed to edit them out. And the things that happened to me when I was, 13, 16. And those were just two examples. I mean, so many things. I grew up in New York City and I was a latchkey kid. It was, a lot of things happened on the street, like with men. And she just couldn't show up for me with that. She was enraged about it, I think. I felt the rage was coming toward me, not these men. But I think really what it was just this misdirected rage of being unable to prevent these things from happening. And I think she ended up unleashing that rage on me. I think there was a sense of, I can't save you from this. So, I'm kind of like throwing you to the wolves and you'll have to figure it out. Like, there's nothing I can do to save you from this. And so I'm just going to let you sink or swim, which was incredibly painful, because sometimes just having your mom there to say, like, okay, like, first of all, like, it's okay. Let me just hold you, let me just comfort you. She didn't have that. She couldn't do that for me. So that is a real deficit on her part, and it's not just about like what society says a mother should be able to do. That's just a deficit as a person, to not be able to face the brutal, heartbreaking, painful things in life, to want everything to be nice. And I think for my mom, that was really important. She wanted things to look perfect. And as long as things looked perfect, like, that would do. And there are a lot of people like that in life that are just like, they're just not, maybe they're kind of like trauma, what's the word I'm looking for? Like, that bucket is full. Like, they just don't have any more space. And she wouldn't get help. That was, I think, a really key thing. And I do think that's a big, if you do not get help when you need it, if you insist on, it's like, it's probably not going to go well, particularly when you're talking about like losing your dad at 13, and then she lost her mom at 28, and then my uncle, passed away. Like, she lost her whole family of origin, which is really young. And then my dad left like the week after her mom died, and so she's a single mom with a 4-year-old. Like, a lot of things happened that I can look back on and say, none of that is easy. And never did she say to herself, let me go talk to someone. Let me try going to therapy for a little while. Let me see if there's something I can do for myself to kind of like work through this, so that I'm not in this state of fear or rage or feeling, disempowered or like she just didn't seek out any help or support. She wouldn't admit there was a problem. So, and that is part of like the Danny's podcast, which is so beautiful. And there's an episode of the podcast called "I Dug It Up," and I highly recommend that. That is another example of a mother who abandons her daughter in just the most profound way, with really very little closure given, very little explanation, just hardcore, like, we are done with each other. So there are things that happen in this world they're just so hard to wrap your head around, and you don't need to make sense of them. Like, certain things will never make sense no matter what you do or how long you live or how hard you try to kind of like make something fit. Sometimes you just have to say this person is not able to show up, for whatever reason. I saw somebody else write an article about Alice Munro and say, like, because I do think that it changes the way that you look at her work after her daughter told her what had happened, which is basically like anything she wrote after 1992. And I was reading somebody who was saying, like, because you can see there are some, like, she wrote a story called Vandals. There's like some things that she wrote where she's clearly trying to grapple with the situation, but the bottom line is that when she was clearly asked to choose her child, she said no. She didn't. That is not what she did. And so this person that was writing about it said, she was just like a small selfish person, and she wrote about small selfish people sometimes. Like, she was very good at writing about people who just made choices for their own survival, and that's it. And why should we be surprised? Well, okay. But I also think when someone's art is so beautiful and layered and honest, right, you do think that this person is living their life in that way. And so when you find out they weren't, it is not just, deeply horrifying and disappointing and disconcerting. It's also like, wow, there's a big, maybe she was trying to grapple with this stuff, but she didn't get there. And that's, it changes the way that you feel. I mean, it's hard for it not to. But I think the thing that I really wanted to focus on today is just, if you are someone who grew up with a confusing mother, it's a painful road. It's a painful road. And one of the main threads in the essay that I was writing about is just the people who show up in your life and teach you that you're very much lovable. The people that you can text or call when you're not okay, and they're going to be there for you. And I am very lucky with that. Very, like, so incredibly, lucky with beautiful people in my life. And I was focusing on like 4 women in my life who are so incredible, because that maternal, nurturing, I have your back no matter what energy, you might not get it from your mom, but you can get it from your girlfriends. You can get that. And I mean, let's also say there are men who can be incredibly maternal and nurturing. They exist. But, I was focusing on the women in my life who are extraordinary. And I think that is something that maybe we could talk about a little bit more, just like love letters to our friends, because that's the stuff when you're feeling bereft and alone or overwhelmed. Like, those are the people. And that's that maternal energy, whether it came from your mom or it didn't. And also at a certain point to recognize, if your mom failed to mother you in a way that felt good, it's on her. It's not about you. It was her failing, her deficit. It's not a reflection on you, even though it's so hard when you're a kid to see that. And it took me a lot of work to understand, to stop looking at my childhood through that lens of like, my mom didn't love me. She did love me. And at the very end of her life, and I wrote about this too, my mom got ALS out of nowhere. And I can't talk about it for too long, so I'll just start like weeping. I miss my mother. I do not wish I had a different mom. I am very much the person I am because she was the person she was. And I can see that really clearly. As painful as it was sometimes to be her daughter, I would not have wanted a different mom. Like, even in the ways that I had to heal and recover and examine things and think about things, that stuff has made me, who I am. And I'm not confused. I don't feel broken. I know I'm lovable, but it was a real journey. It wasn't easy. And it took a long time to kind of be able to step away, have a little space there, disentangle myself from her storyline and see her as a human being and recognize like, oh, she was so stuck and it really had nothing to do with me. It's just like I showed up in her timeline at a moment where she was just really not equipped to mother me. And I think that ability to, separate that out and not take things personally when someone is failing to show up in a way that feels good to you is such an essential part of healing. It just makes life easier. Even forget about your mom, just in daily life when people are doing things that feel like incredibly thoughtless or hurtful or confusing, just to recognize, okay, this is a reflection on like where they are right now in this moment or where they are in their lives, or like, if this is how they think it's okay to treat people, like this is a reflection on them, not me. That is, I think, an essential part of healing and kind of mothering yourself, like nurturing yourself, and also distancing yourself from people who are unable to show up in a way that's kind and respectful. Those are not people you want in your inner circle. And sometimes it's tough because it's family. And with my mom, certainly, like, because I'm focused on that in this talk, like I had to maneuver and figure out how to have boundaries and how to defend those boundaries and maintain them and reassert them, and it was hard, but I didn't want to cut her out of my life. And I never did. And at the very end, that's what I was starting to touch on. She got ALS. And my mother had been, as I said, she was very focused her whole life on how things looked and making things look perfect. She grew up in Jersey City. She told me she's always looking across the Hudson at Manhattan, thinking that was like the glamorous life. She managed to move there. And a lot of things became about like how to, she always was put together. My mother was a beautiful like woman and just always hair done, makeup done, perfume, jewelry, like shoes, handbag, like everything perfect. I do not have that. That was not passed along to me. I'm like in yoga clothes most of the time. Jeans are like, if it's got a zipper and a button, I'm dressed up. But she was just very, very put together, and we had Christmas card photos every year and everybody had to look perfect, and like they got bigger and bigger and more complicated, and the backgrounds became more essential, and Radio City Music, like it became a thing. And it didn't matter what was happening inside the family, just it had to look perfect. And at the end of her life, she got ALS, and I mean, it ravaged her. It's one of the most brutal diseases. It just takes everything, like everything away from you. She lost the ability to swallow, so she couldn't drink anymore. She couldn't eat anymore. She had to get a feeding tube. She lost the ability over a year to speak, to eat, to drink, to, do anything. At the end, she was in the ICU. That's where she spent the last month of her life. But all the vanity was like stripped away. This is a woman, I never saw her naked. Even when it was just the two of us in the apartment and I was a little kid, I was outside the bathroom when she was getting ready. She let me in if she had a bra and like a slip on, then I was allowed in. At the end of her life, when she was in the ICU, it was just, she was done with all that. She didn't care anymore. She couldn't care anymore. It was like she was just bones in a bed, but her eyes were like, I don't know if you've ever seen the brown eyes of a baby that are like a little bit blue. It started to happen at the very end. And she was just like, she just looked at me with nothing but love, like nothing but love, just everything else had been like stripped away. All the rage, all the storylines, all the narratives, all the whatever, because she had her own, she struggled with me too. She's very angry that I would not just kind of toe the line and say, okay, you don't have a drinking problem, like she struggled because I couldn't do it after a certain point. I couldn't keep pretending there wasn't like a serious problem, and that was to her, by her way of thinking, a betrayal. So we struggled. We had a tough time. But at the very end, I think she realized, like, my daughter is like flying home to Los Angeles for a night, and then she's turning around and flying back so she can be in the ICU with me 12 hours a day. And, I was just advocating for her and like talking to the doctors and talking to the nurses and trying to just figure out the best possible way to ease her suffering. So I think she just realized, like, there's no other reason someone would do this unless they just loved me so much. And I think it finally, she just dropped all the other stuff, and just loved me. And like, it was beautiful. And I'm incredibly grateful we got there before she died. It was literally on her deathbed, I think, where she finally could admit, oh, like, maybe I was wrong. Maybe I was wrong about all this. We had some really profound and meaningful conversations that have given me a lot of peace I wouldn't have had otherwise. So all of that just to say that, it's not easy when that is the road that you're traveling, when you have a confusing mother. It's really hard not to receive that as a reflection on something broken in you, but it is not. And to hopefully have a lot of compassion for yourself and patience with yourself, and also seek out your people, if you haven't. Like, do your best to, it doesn't have to be a lot of people, but just have people that know how to nurture you, and also really focus on nurturing yourself. I really hope that this has been helpful, and I'm sending you a lot of love. And I think that part of like everything that I do, whether I'm doing the podcast or I'm writing an essay or I'm teaching, is my attempt to send that kind of like mothering energy out, because I know how much I needed it along the way. So I hope that if that's what you need, I hope you're feeling that. And I'm sending you a lot of love.